The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of the small Arizona town. The air smelled of dry earth, sweat, and gunpowder, mingling with the faint scent of leather and tobacco from the saloon. A group of ranchers and gamblers had gathered near the wooden fence that bordered the town's main street, their boots kicking up clouds of dust with every impatient shuffle. Atop the fence, a line of glass bottles glinted in the sunlight, perfectly balanced like fragile treasures waiting to be destroyed. "Hit every one of them," a tall, sneering man called out, his hat tilted back on his head, "and you'll win yourself an Apache girl." His voice was mocking, dripping with cruelty. The crowd erupted into laughter, some jeering, some whispering bets among themselves. At a corner of the gathering, a young Apache woman sat tied to a wagon, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes sharp with defiance. She was small, yet her presence demanded attention. She did not flinch at the jeers, instead, she fixed her gaze on the cowboy who had just entered the scene. Luke, a rugged cowboy known for his steady hands and quiet courage, dismounted from his horse. His leather boots crunched against the sand, and his fingers brushed the worn grip of his rifle. He hated the game, hated the thought of anyone being treated as a prize, but something inside him stirred, a mix of pride, justice, and the instinct to protect. "You're up, cowboy," one of the men barked, shoving him toward the bottles. Luke didn't answer. He studied the line of bottles, each perched precariously on the fence. Some were empty, some half full, their green and brown glass catching the sunlight. It was more than a challenge, it was a test of skill and nerve. One wrong shot, and he could lose not only his pride but also risk the girl's safety. He knelt slightly, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. The crowd quieted, sensing the tension in the air. A wind kicked up from the desert, carrying dust and a few stray leaves past the onlookers. Luke's pulse was steady, every muscle in his body was tuned to precision. He inhaled deeply, his eyes narrowing on the first bottle. The crowd held its breath as Luke aimed. Time seemed to slow. A single shot rang out, sharp and clean, shattering the bottle into tiny fragments. Murmurs of awe rippled through the spectators. One by one, Luke moved along the fence, each shot striking true, each bottle exploding with a satisfying clink of glass. His hands were steady, his focus unbroken, and the Apache girl watched him with a mixture of curiosity and hope. By the time he reached the final bottle, the sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. The last bottle shimmered in the fading light. Luke took a steadying breath, finger brushing the trigger, and fired. The glass shattered into sparkling fragments, and for a moment, silence blanketed the town. Then the crowd erupted, a mix of cheers and angry curses. Luke lowered his rifle and stepped closer to the wagon. "Untie her," he said, his voice calm but firm. The tension was broken, replaced by the spark of hope in the girl's eyes. She looked at him, hesitant, yet something in her gaze told him she understood. This was no ordinary victory, it was the beginning of a story neither of them could have imagined. The moment the last bottle shattered, the air seemed to thrum with tension. The crowd's cheers mixed with curses, some shaking their fists, others nodding in grudging admiration. Luke lowered his rifle, dust swirling around his boots like a halo of defiance. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the tall man who had made the cruel bet. "Untie her," Luke said again, louder this time, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man's face darkened, a vein pulsing in his temple. "You think you can just walk away with her? She's a person, not a prize," Luke interrupted, his voice calm but deadly serious. The crowd murmured, some in shock at the rare words of justice, others whispering their agreement. The man hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, with a reluctant grunt, he gestured to a couple of his men. They stepped forward and cut the ropes binding the Apache girl to the wagon. She rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving Luke's. For a moment, silence fell over the town square, broken only by the distant howl of the desert wind. Luke extended his hand, a gesture of trust. She looked at it for a heartbeat, cautious yet intrigued. Slowly, she took it, and together they stepped away from the jeering crowd. "Name's Luke," he said quietly as they moved toward his horse. "What's yours?" "Nayeli," she replied, her voice steady but soft, tinged with curiosity. Luke swung onto his horse, gesturing for her to do the same. She hesitated, glancing back at the crowd, then at the men who still watched with barely concealed anger. Without a word, she climbed onto the horse behind him, gripping the saddle tightly. Luke adjusted his hold, careful not to frighten her, and urged the horse into a smooth trot. The town quickly faded behind them, the desert stretching endlessly ahead. The sun dipped lower, painting the sand in shades of gold and crimson. Their shadows stretched long across the dunes, a cowboy and an Apache girl riding side by side into uncertainty. "Why help me?" Nayeli finally asked, breaking the tense silence that had followed their escape. Her dark eyes reflected the fading sunlight, curious and wary. Luke didn't answer immediately. He glanced at her, then forward toward the horizon. "Because you didn't deserve to be anyone's prize," he said at last. "Because some things are worth standing up for, even if it makes you enemies." Nayeli studied him, a flicker of something like admiration, or perhaps hope, crossing her face. She said nothing more, but her grip on the saddle relaxed slightly, a silent acknowledgement of trust. Hours passed as they rode, the desert growing colder as night approached. The stars emerged one by one, scattered across the sky like scattered jewels. Luke kept the horse steady, his mind alert to every sound, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of brush, the soft breathing of the girl behind him. For the first time in a long while, Nayeli felt a glimmer of freedom. The chains of fear and captivity were behind her, replaced by the rhythm of hooves and the steady hand of someone who had chosen to protect, not claim. And Luke, for his part, knew the night ahead would be dangerous. But as he rode under the endless Arizona sky, he felt the quiet satisfaction of having done what was right, and that no bottle, no bet, could ever measure the courage it took to free someone from injustice. Night had fully fallen over the desert, and the stars shimmered like cold diamonds above the endless dunes. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the occasional rustle of dry brush. Luke guided the horse steadily, keeping an ear out for any sign that the men from the town might be following. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and sand, sharp against the cool night air. Behind him, Nayeli clung tightly to the saddle, her eyes wide but alert. She was silent, her mind racing. This was freedom, yes, but it was dangerous freedom, ridden with uncertainty. Luke stole a glance at her. Despite the fear etched in her delicate features, he saw a spark of determination, of someone who refused to be anyone's possession again. "We have to keep moving," Luke whispered. "They'll send someone after us. Most of the men there aren't the forgiving type." Nayeli nodded. She didn't speak, but the slight squeeze of her hand around his waist told him she understood. Her trust was fragile, but it was there, and that trust was worth protecting at all costs. The desert stretched endlessly, but Luke knew a safe path. He navigated by memory, heading toward a small creek that cut through the dunes like a silver ribbon under the moonlight. The water promised not only refuge but a place to rest and regroup. They rode in silence, the only interruptions being the horse's steady breathing and the occasional rustle of nocturnal animals stirring in the desert. Hours passed, the darkness deepening, until finally, they reached the creek. Luke dismounted, offering his hand to Nayeli, who slipped off the horse gracefully. They knelt beside the water, drinking carefully and letting the coolness soothe their parched throats. Luke's eyes scanned the surrounding darkness, alert for any sign of pursuit, but for now, the night was theirs alone. Finally, Nayeli broke the silence. Why risk yourself for me?" she asked softly, her voice barely carrying over the gentle babble of the creek. Luke looked at her, the moonlight casting shadows across his rugged features. "Because no one deserves to be treated like property," he said simply. "And because when you see something wrong, you fix it. That's all there is to it." For a moment, she studied him, the fire of her spirit meeting the steady calm in his eyes. Then, slowly, she allowed herself to smile, a small, cautious smile, but a smile nonetheless. The kind of smile that comes when hope finally breaks through fear. They built a small fire nearby, using dry wood from the desert brush. The flames cast dancing shadows on their faces, illuminating Nayeli's features for the first time without fear. They ate what little food Luke had brought, dried meat and bread, and listened to the night settle around them. Luke kept watch while Nayeli slept, wrapped in a blanket he had offered. Every sound, every movement in the shadows, set his nerves on edge. But he also felt something deeper, a quiet satisfaction that he had chosen the right path, that his actions had given someone her freedom. As the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, Luke knew the night was only the beginning. Danger would come again, and the desert was unforgiving. But for the first time, he felt certain of one thing: Nayeli would no longer face it alone. Together, they could face anything. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert in warm hues of gold and amber. Luke and Naeli sat beside the creek, the chill of the night giving way to the gentle warmth of the morning sun. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and fresh water. For the first time since their flight from the town, there was a sense of peace. Naeli stirred and opened her eyes, blinking against the sunlight. She looked at Luke, gratitude and curiosity mingling in her gaze. "We made it through the night," she whispered, almost to herself. Luke nodded. "We did, but we can't stop here. Not yet." She sat up and brushed sand from her clothes, her movements graceful despite the tension of the previous night. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice steady now, the fear slowly replaced by resolve. Luke considered this. "East, toward the hills. There are people there, friends, families, who won't hunt you for being Apache. We'll find a safe place to rest, to start again." Naeli nodded. She trusted him, not blindly, but with the quiet certainty that comes from seeing courage in action. She untied a small piece of cloth from her wrist, weaving it into a simple braid in Luke's hair as a sign of respect and gratitude. "For protection," she said. Softly, they rode through the morning light, the desert awakening around them. Birds called from distant cliffs, and the wind whispered across the dunes. Luke kept a careful watch, ever alert, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Their journey was no longer about escape alone, it was about building something new, together. As the day wore on, they found shelter beneath a cluster of rocks near a hidden spring. Luke cleaned and prepared a small breakfast, and Naeli helped, her hands moving skillfully, her confidence growing with every moment spent in freedom. Conversation came slowly at first, then flowed more easily, stories shared and laughter emerging cautiously. The walls built by fear and captivity were crumbling, replaced by trust and companionship. When the sun reached its peak, Luke handed Naeli a small bracelet he had fashioned from leather and a few desert beads. "For strength," he said. She smiled, slipping it onto her wrist and returning the gesture with a similar bracelet made of woven grasses. "Together, then," she said, her voice firm and warm. "Together," Luke agreed. They rode on, the horizon stretching endlessly before them, a symbol of endless possibilities. Each mile carried them further from fear, further from the cruelty of a town that sought to treat a person as a prize. Each mile strengthened a bond forged through courage, respect, and the shared understanding that freedom was a treasure worth defending. By the time the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the desert, Naeli and Luke had become more than allies, they were companions, friends, and perhaps something even deeper. The West was vast and unforgiving, but together, they faced it with hearts unchained, spirits resilient, and eyes fixed on a future neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed. In a land ruled by danger, dust, and lawless men, Luke and Naeli had found something rare and precious: trust, freedom, and the promise of new beginnings. And as the sun dipped below the distant hills, their journey continued, not as a tale of conquest or prize, but as a story of courage, respect, and the human spirit rising above cruelty.